In finer bookstores now.
Well, thanks very much for that warm introduction. And it truly great comes along with my heart. Thanks to the light, because you wouldn't believe how many mistakes I would have been discredited, I think, before I got to first base for Lloyd. So he's my savior in this, and I really appreciate it. And as Lloyd said, I'm going to talk to you today about the economic catastrophe that befell the NHL in the 1970s and the forces behind that economic catastrophe. And I'm drawing everything from the book, which is in bookstores officially on Tuesday. And I'll begin by providing you an overview of the book for those of you who didn't catch my performance or talk at the Hall of Fame Resource Center 3 weeks ago. It is a start to present-day history, and I began in the winter of 1916-17 and the final season of the National Hockey Association. And infighting between Eddie Livingston and his other owners led to the implosion of the NHA and gave rise to the creation of the National Hockey League. And I conclude with the lockout-shortened 2012-2013 season, and actually managed to secure an interview with Don Fair about 2 days before I had to hand in my final pages, and I've been able to include his thoughts on the lockout and the owners. And the book contains 17 chapters. It's divided into 4 parts. Part 1, To Thick and Thin with Frank Calder, runs from 1916 to 1943, and includes a short chapter on the tenure of Merv Dutton, who is a very important figure in the history of the league. Part 2, The Long Reign of Clarence Campbell, runs from 1946 to 1977. Part 3, The American at the Helm, is devoted to the tenure of John Ziegler, 1977 to 1992. And it includes a short chapter on Gil Stein, who was without doubt the worst chief executive the NHL ever had.
Hall of Famer.
As Senator Hartman Olsen said, maybe we should include the local Zamboni driver. Part 4, the Bettman era, begins in February 1993 and brings us up to the present. Now, many of us have fond memories of the 1970s. Our memories tend to coalesce around the great players and the great teams. Orr, Espo, and the Big Bad Bruins, Bobby Clark, Bernie Ferrant, and the Rod Street Gaules, and the last great Canadian dynasty and its galaxy of stars. Dryden and Net, Robinson, Savard, and LaPointe on the fence, the Fleur, Lemaire, Gainey, and all the rest of that potent defense. But the writer who sets out to explore the history of the league has to take a broader outlook, and he or she has to take account of the good, the bad, the ugly, and everything in between. And with that in mind, I'm going to take as my starting point today the fall of 1977. Clarence Campbell had recently resigned as president. He was 72 years old, and he had run the league for 31 years. John Ziegler was settling in as his successor. He was in the habit of staying late in the evening and reviewing files in order to familiarize himself with all aspects of league operations. One evening, he saw a light in the office of Jim Ford, the chief financial officer. And Ford had been around the league longer than Clarence Campbell. He actually started out as an outside auditor in the early 1940s during the tenure of Merv Dutton. So Ziegler goes down to his office, and well, actually Ziegler was he was looking for the monthly financials and these files, and he couldn't find the monthly financial statements. So he goes down to Jim Ford's office, and he asks about this, and we're going to read you an excerpt here. And this is all one long quote from John Ziegler. It was about 8 o'clock, and I asked him if he had a moment and could he come to my office, Ziegler recalled. And I said, Jim, I've looked all over and I've asked around and nobody can find the monthly financials. And he laughed and he said, I can give you the reason. We don't have them. I said, you don't have them? He just has the interim budget. How do you know how we're doing? He said, don't worry, we're always close. That phrase, we're always close, has stuck with me ever since. Anyway, I said, Finance is not my strong suit, but I've been on 2 or 3 boards and I've come to be able to read financial statements. Let me bring in copies of those, and you pick the one you like. Could you please set up monthly financial statements? He said, sure, I can do that. 2 or 3 weeks went by, and again it's about 8 o'clock at night, and I see his light on. I asked him to come in, and I asked him, Jim, how are you coming along with those monthly financial statements? He says, oh, I just haven't had time. I said, you haven't had time? Can you tell me what's taken up all your time? And he said, well, you know this league is insolvent. And I said, what? He said, don't you know this league is insolvent? I said, Jim, I don't know this league is insolvent. The owners don't know this league is insolvent. And fortunately, the world doesn't know this league is insolvent. And I said, how about at 8:30 in the morning, you take me through the nature of this insolvency? He said, fine. So I went back to the Ritz. I got my spot at the bar. I ordered my martini. My first thought as I was taking a sip was, I wonder if my law firm is taking my name off the door. Essentially, the liabilities of the league exceeded the assets. And there were 3 problems. The league was losing money on its US TV contracts. Its merchandising sales were barely breaking even or making little profit. And a number of financially distressed clubs were not paying their dues to the league. And one of the main culprits was the New York Islanders. Now the Islanders had star players at every position. They had Billy Smith in goal, Jenny Potvin on defense, Brian Trottier at center, and Clark Gillies at left wing, and this dazzling young rookie named Mike Bossy at right wing. And the Islanders were emerging as a Stanley Cup contender, but the organization was headed for bankruptcy. And the problem was a man named Roy Bowe. And Roy was the managing director of the Islanders, and he was also managing director of the New York Nets, the National Basketball Association. Both teams are based on Long Island, and they played out of the Nassau County Coliseum. Now, the Islanders usually made a little bit of money. They've been in the league 5 seasons. They always kind of broke even or made a little bit of money. But the Nets were a perennial money loser. So Roy Bowe goes to one bank and he starts borrowing money to prop up the Nets, and he uses the Islanders' assets as collateral. And the Islanders start to wobble a little bit, so he goes to another bank and he borrows money to prop up the Islanders, and he uses the assets of the Nets as collateral against loans. Now, cross-collateralizing your loans is a fraudulent bit of business. Could have led to criminal charges, could have wound up in jail. But Roy had one thing going for him. He was a real nice guy. Everybody liked Roy. And as Ziegler puts it, he could talk you out of your watch and you wouldn't know it was gone. In fact, you'd probably be happy to know he had it. So the Islanders' problems came to a head at the NHL annual general meeting in June of 1978. And as Bill Torrey told me, at that point they were about 20 minutes from bankruptcy. Fortunately, Torrey and John Pickett, who was one of the investors in the Islanders, had put together a financial rescue plan. It was accepted by the court, and the Islanders were given time to work out their problems. And the league had 2 other troubled franchises to deal with that summer. And the problems of the Colorado Rockies surfaced first. And you may recall that the Colorado Rockies began their life in 1974-75 as the Kansas City Scouts. And the Scouts lasted 2 seasons and cost their ownership group a bundle of money. At the end of the 1975-76 season, the owners laid off the entire front office of the Scouts, including general manager Sid Abel and his assistant Baz Bastian. They sold the franchise that summer to Jack Vickers, who was a Denver oilman. And he moved the franchise to Denver and renamed it the Colorado Rockies. And he endured 2 seasons, he endured 2 money-losing seasons before his patience was exhausted, and he showed up at the 1978 annual meeting demanding the right to move the franchise. Gentlemen, he said in a drawl that reflected his Colorado roots, I learned a long time ago if you drill a dry hole, get out of the area. For the last 2 years, I've drilled nothing but dry holes. I don't know why I'm still here. His fellow owners practiced preach patience, which he replied, gentlemen, you see there's light at the end of the tunnel? That may be, but it's a freight train coming at us. Vickers agreed to stay put for the time being, and that was a good thing because there was another extremely pressing problem facing the league, and that was the Cleveland Barons. And the Barons had begun life as the Oakland California Seals. They were later renamed the California Seals. They began as the California Seals. They were later renamed the Oakland Seals, and I think they became the California Golden Seals. And they went through a series of owners, including that notorious crank Charles O. Finley, and the Board of Governors finally got fed up with Finley's shenanigans and forced him to sell out. They found a new owner, a guy named Mel Swig, who is a San Francisco hotelier, and he kept the Seals in Oakland for one more season, and then he moved them to Cleveland for the 1976-77 season, and he promptly ran out of money. The Barons missed the payroll on February 1st, 1977, and they missed it again on February 15th, at which point the players gave Mel an ultimatum, pay up or we quit. Now this caused panic in the league offices because the league was suddenly facing both a scheduling and a PR nightmare. So Ziegler and Alan Eagleson made an emergency trip to Cleveland and begged the players to suit up for their weekend games, and they cooked up a rescue scheme under which the NHLPA would loan the Barons $600,000 to get them through the season. At the end of the season, Swig said he'd had enough and sold out to George and Gordon Gunn, who were two guys originally from Cleveland. Well, the Gunn brothers kept the Barons in Cleveland one season and decided their hometown was hopeless, and they decided they proposed a merger with the Minnesota North Stars. And the guys who owned the North Stars were ready to bail because, as Walter Bush told me, and he was president at the time, he said, we've lost so much, or we were losing so much money, we just got tired of kicking a can down the road. The league had never allowed or even contemplated a merger before, although there was nothing in the league bylaws to prevent that. So this prompted a long discussion, a lot of debate at the board meetings. At one point, one wisecrack, the general manager said, well, you mix one bag of shit with another bag of shit, all you got is a bigger bag of shit. Basically solve the problem. And there were other problems, franchise problems in the 1970s as well. In December 1976, the Atlanta Flames were on the brink of going under. Atlanta Mayor Maynard Jackson, State Governor George Busby led the rescue effort. They convinced 40 of the city's leading corporations to buy blocks of tickets for $25,000 each, and the players bought a block of tickets for $25,000. But they gave them to Governor Busby, who donated them to state employees as Christmas gifts. And the Pittsburgh Penguins had gone through several ownership changes in their first decade in the NHL, but at the end of the 1975 season, they wound up in bankruptcy as well. The Penguins owed a Pittsburgh bank $5 million, they owed the league $1 million, and they owed the Internal Revenue Service $500,000 for unpaid taxes. And on June 12, 1975, IRS officials showed up at Penguins' offices, confiscated the player contracts, which were the only assets of any value, ordered the employees out, and padlocked the doors. Suffice to say that the NHL in the 1970s was in bad shape, and the reasons were quite straightforward. The league tripled in size in 8 seasons. In 1966-67, there were 6 teams. In 1974-75, there were 18. To make matters worse, in 1972-73, the World Hockey Association came along and added another 12 teams. So in effect, in the space of a decade, you suddenly had the number of North American professional hockey teams aspiring to Major League status suddenly grown from 6 to 30. So it increased fivefold. The demand for players increased accordingly. But the supply of players had not increased one iota. And two things happen in any business when you increase the demand for a product, a commodity, or a service fivefold, and supply of the goods do not increase at all, prices skyrocket. And this is obviously very bad for the people who have to write the paychecks, which is the owners of the teams, but it's also not terribly good for the fans who have to ultimately pay the higher prices. And to make matters worse, while prices were going up, the quality of play was going down. And so this is evident if you look at the gap between first and worst. That gap in 1967-68, the first season of expansion, was 47 points. It widened each of the next two seasons, and then in 1970-71, when Buffalo and Vancouver came, the gap grew to 76 points, and it hit a staggering 90 points in 72-73, when the Canadians piled up 120 points, and the Islanders a mere 30 points, which was a record low for the expansion era. In 1975-76, the Washington Capitals won 11 games, endured losing streaks of 22 games and 25 games. The Kansas City Scouts won 12 games and established a record for futility with a winless streak of 26 games. At the other end of the spectrum, the Canadians won 58 games, the following season an all-time record of 60 games. Now, a league that has those kinds of discrepancies is a fundamentally dysfunctional league with fundamental problems. And Pierre Boivin, the former president of Montreal Canadiens, once told me that professional sports teams are in the business of putting smiles on people's faces. The way you do that is to win. And what they're really selling is hope. The hope that at the outset of the season, your team has a chance to win the championship. And the problem with the NHL in the 1970s was too many teams weren't putting smiles on anybody's faces, and too many teams were beat in the moment that training camp ended and the puck dropped to start the season. So something had to be done. And the most sensible thing to do was to make peace between the NHL and the WHA and reach a combination between the two. But that wasn't going to happen when Clarence Campbell was president because he was adamantly opposed. Furthermore, the Board of Governors was divided. Bill Wirtz of Chicago, Bruce Norris of Detroit, and Harold Ballard of Toronto were all adamantly opposed, and they had followers in their camp. Ed Snyder of the Flyers and Bill Jennings of the Rangers favored a merger, and they had gotten fellow owners in their camps. You had two camps. So John Ziegler, he favored a merger, but he had inherited a divided board. And as he told me, Bill Wirtz and Ed Snyder had become estranged. You could feel the animosity in the boardroom. It was difficult to get things done because we had two camps, and there were loyal followers of Eddie Snyder and loyal followers of Bill Wirtz. Sometimes it would take two meetings to accomplish what you could have done in one. I'd have to pick up the phone and talk to each of them individually to convince them to move on an issue. Now, believe it or not, the man who broke the stalemate of the board was Alan Eagleson. Now, Ziegler was in a difficult position as a new president because he's got a divided board and he's seen to be, he's in one camp, he's going to offend the other guys, and he moves over to the other side of the fence, he's going to offend the other camp and put himself in jeopardy. So, he and Ziegler started talking about what are we going to do to solve this problem, and they decided that what they would do is invite the leaders of the two camps, Wirtz and Snyder, to lunch together at a neutral setting. And Eagleson made the calls, and he invited Snyder and Wirtz without telling each other, the other guy, telling him the other guy's going to be there. So as Eagleson put it in an interview I had with him, I phoned Eddie and I said I'd meet him at the bar at the Waldorf Astoria. I phoned Billy, told him I'd meet him there. John and I get there early. In comes Eddie, in comes Billy. Now their natural inclination was to head for the exits, but these two strong-headed individuals were convinced to stay. They had lunch, the four of them had lunch, and then they went for a walk in Central Park. And Snyder and Wirtz walked together side by side, and Ziegler and Eagleson at a discreet distance behind them. And it was the first time in years that Snyder and Wirtz had had a civil conversation. They started to patch up their differences. And this occurred in the spring of 1978, and it was the first crucial step in healing the rift of the board of the NHL, and that led so that the board, the NHL, could actually successfully start as a unified entity to start negotiating a merger with the WHA, and that came to fruition 12 months later when the NHL took in 4 of the 6 surviving teams of the WHA. And the merger of the NHL and the WHA ended an era of rapid and reckless expansion and ruinous competition between the leagues. And it was the first step toward the restoration of financial sanity, competitive balance, and a healthy league. Thank you very much.
Yes, sir.
What's your assessment of the various league governors and presidents and team owners as businessmen? Were there sound business people running, or were they wingnuts like we had in Toronto?
Well, you get a mix of guys. I mean, there's, as I said, there's a lot of shysters and charlatans. I mean, pro sports like the bright light that attracts various insects of the night. I mean, you're going to get some guys like Peter Pocklington and Bruce McNall, and then you're going to get the Wirtzes and Snyders and, you know, the Jacobs, you know, millionaires and billionaires, but solid business people that stay in for a long time. I mean, I think that's the key to you know, these guys keep the league going. I mean, the Wirtzes have been in the game since, well, formally as owners since 1952. The Norris family was in from 32 to 83. Snyder's been in since 67 to the present day. Jacob's been in since 75 till today. So, you know, you've got some real solid characters in there. On the other hand, you have this rotating merry-go-round people on and off, on and off. You know, there's a lot of turnover in this league. You can just look at what's happened over the past few years. So you got to have a solid core of good owners that, and I was saying to somebody at lunch, one of the interesting things about pro sport is, if you look at the forces for that think short term versus who's thinking long term. Players, coaches, general managers, agents, most of the owners are ultimately short-term thinkers. They're going to be in here for a short time. They want to get as much out of it as they can for themselves. And who's looking after the long-term interests? Who's saying, you know, we're headed in the wrong direction? You got to have a few of those owners in there, I think, who are in for the long haul, stay for the long haul, and take you through the ups and downs. But there's a real mixed bag coming out in the ownership. Yeah, great.
Who did you not get to interview? I mean, you mentioned Ziegler, Eagleson. Those are some pretty big names to sit down with. Who did you want to get and didn't get?
Well, I think I got to everybody I thought I should. I mean, I had about 15 hours with Ziegler. I mean, I think I'm the only person who's really spoken to him. And he really throws some insights and gives you some inside looks at what was going on. I did get to sit down with Beckman. I did get Fair. You couldn't get to Goodenow. He's gone underground.
How about Stein?
I didn't try him. And he's written his book. He wrote a book. I don't know whether he
One of the great books. It's fascinating.
It's fascinating. Now, the interesting thing he told me, the interesting thing that Brian O'Neill told me, Brian O'Neill is one of the guys he fired, and Brian O'Neill's never forgiven him for it. Brian O'Neill said he used to take copious notes at the meetings. So obviously, and that's what you would gather from reading that book. Now, the other thing is that when I read his book, especially those talks, there were several events that he talks about, like his account of the merger talks with the WHA in this early 1979. really doesn't line up very well with what's in the papers, and it also doesn't line up with Ziegler's account. Now, when you get multiple participants, you're going to be in any of these big events, these big pressure cooker things with conflicting views, you're going to get different views, different perspectives. But I don't know, and Stein is going to be self-serving.
Where did you get the idea to go to the Hall of Fame himself?
Yeah, so I don't know. But to your question, I'd have to think about who I didn't get. I mean, I know there was people I chased, but my mind's a little. But I mean, I did get a lot of the people I wanted to get. I think the important people who tell me, I mean, Ziegler was a key person in my opinion. I talked to Eagleson mainly. He gave me some little things, but I started getting walked away from my talks with Eagleson, thinking that he was an innocent man who was wrongly convicted. I didn't come away from that with that impression. And he did tell me he spent $3 million trying to defend himself, and then finally just said, let's get this over with because I'm getting too old to fight this for the rest of my life. So, but I did have a couple sessions with him. I asked him certain questions that just drew blanks. I said, I said to him, well, did you ever think of just stepping down and getting out of this thing with people attacking you? And things like a question like, I think his reaction was like, what? No, that never occurred to me, So there were certain things I wanted to ask, that I did ask him about, and it was useful. So. Yeah, Bill.
Clarence Campbell, was he a financial man, you think? Was he take an interest?
As far as I know, I mean, no, I've got some other stuff in here in my talk to the Hall of Fame I did on the Regional 6 era, and I've got these 3 chapters based on these verbatim transcripts of Board of Governors meetings. So we're hearing these guys talk back and forth, and they're really just dealing with the day-to-day, certain problems with the league, but Clarence Campbell overstayed his welcome. I mean, he was going to die with the boots on, as they say. He didn't want, they had to push him out of office. He was in his 70s. He should have been gone probably at age 65. I think he never should have allowed to stay in. The league was too big, too complicated. He was too old school. He had no concept of developing a modern, head office organization. And he left the organization, and John Ziegler, he said those TV contracts, he said it took me months to sort those things out. And Clint Campbell had illnesses at the end, and then he got implicated in this Sky Shops stock scam, and that really consumed his interest. So he was way over his head at the end, I think. Should have been gone much sooner than he was.
But he, compared to today, he ran the NHL on very little.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, this Frank Brown guy, who's the communications guy for Bettman in New York, and it's kind of like shadows him wherever he goes. Frank's got a little bit of a mafia, of course, or demeanor about him. Frank was a reporter for the New York Daily News or the New York Post back in the 70s. He was a young guy just starting out. He told me, I could phone Clarence Campbell, in the 1970s. I could just phone the NHL office, and he'd pick up the phone, the answer to Campbell here. He answered his own phone. He took his own calls. Campbell here, just to answer a call from a reporter. So, he really, the league was a very small, league office, small rudimentary operation. And just for comparison's sake, I was going to try to draw a parallel in this talk, but Merv Dutton, Frank Calder dies in February 1943. There's a massive heart attack. Really wore himself out and went to an early grave because of trying to keep that league going through the dirty 30s and the early war years. Those were horrible years. The dirty 30s and the 70s were 2 worst eras in the history of the league. But he left the NHL with money in the bank, and there was a dividend paid out to the clubs at the end. And it's all in here, the number of, he's got Dominion of Canada bonds, $40,000, and next time $520, right down to the nickels and dimes. He left money in the bank coming through the dirty 30s and the early war years. And Ziegler comes along in 1977 after Campbell, and the league operation is insolvent. So, interesting differences.
Who were your best sources?
Well, I'd say Ziegler was darn good. I mean, Ziegler, for whatever reason, opened up, and we talked on the phone a whole pile of times. And then I went down to, he finally wanted to meet me, so I went down to Florida, spent a weekend with him at his place, and he's got a place it's called Stewart, Florida. It's on the Atlantic side, and it's just north of West Palm Beach, a few of those places, and so we spent a weekend together, and he's a great guy. He's a real nice guy, and he's a natural storyteller. I mean, this thing where I quote him, and there's other places I quote him like that at length. He can go, he said, I said, he said, I said, and so he's got some great stories, that he told me. So he was certainly one guy who I would say was pretty key, but again, you're catching me. If I look through my list of people, I've probably listed about 30, 40, 50 people that I am. The other key thing is those transcripts. I mean, I went through meeting after meeting, those transcripts where these guys are talking, it's just back and forth.
Are those accessible on the phone?
Yeah, well, they're at the Hall of Fame, so, and there's a ton of material. I mean, there's huge discussions in those transcripts about the pension plan and setting it up and getting it going. And I couldn't go through it all. I couldn't go through all of that material. But I mean, if somebody wanted to go back and really get a sense of what they were trying to achieve, what the objections were, there's a real big, long discussion about the establishment of the NHL pension plan. And that's sort of, that may be helpful to go back and look at that and see what's in there. I kind of read it all over fairly quickly. But there's lots in those transcripts that you could go through.
Is there any reference to the Hall of Fame?
Gee, I think there was now. I think there was a brief reference. Like, see, they had a lot of things in passing. I mean, there was a lot of little references and a lot of joking and kibitzing and back and forth. And
These are taped.
no, it's they have somebody in the room recording, like making notes, who could go by hand.
Like a stenographer, like
Yeah.
a board stenographer.
Yeah, this type of, it's quite incredible. I mean, you can tell that the language is a little bit stilted because he doesn't use like contractions to kind of formalize it. But I mean, they're very authentic, and you look at them, and the way these conversations unfold, the debates go back and forth. You got to be convinced by them that this was a very comprehensive and accurate record of what these guys are saying. I mean, we're talking Clarence Campbell, Conn Smythe is always popping off. I mean, boom, 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 he just never shut up. And Art Ross is in there. You can get testiness of Art Ross comes across. Lester Patrick's in there. Jack Adams. Jack Adams doesn't say much. James Norris doesn't really show up much in these meetings. I went through them from 41 to 57, and he died in December 52, so he's not a real big presence there at all. He just comes in and occasionally says, "Oh, nice report, very good, Clarence." He doesn't say very much, but Conn Smythe is sort of popping off all the time. But they're great records. They're going to read.
Well, he was a Leaf fan.
Huh?
He was a Leaf fan. He
Yeah.
never shut up.
You never get Sunday.
Is anyone from the Canadians about accepting the Northeast affiliation?
This is the one that was funny. Okay, you asked about who I didn't get, Marcelo Booth. I wanted to talk to him, especially about the end of the interview. No, unfortunately, that was dead. But
Curious to hear someone on the record.
Yeah. Well, some of that is in Gil Stein's book. He talks about some of that. But Marcelo Booth is the one guy I tried very hard to get. But he was chairman of the Canadian Olympic Committee at the time. And I had an interview scheduled with him, and his assistant phones me just before I'm about to go out the door to head into the city because he was going to be down, the offices down on the waterfront there. And Mr. Booth can't see you today, and then I never did get the guy. So that was the one guy I didn't get was Marcelo Booth that I would like to talk to.
D'Arcy, was there any incident or comment or something that triggered this book? How did you get started on it?
Well, I was just looking for the next book. You know, you always finish one book and you want to say, what am I going to do next? So we'd had some ideas and that I was supposed to do, and I wrote some proposals, like 5,000 words, 7,000 words. Sent them in to my publisher. I just had this big hit with the Canadians, and so you know, they're going to jump on whatever I sent in, but they didn't like that. So we sat down and talked. I said, well, you know, the NHL's got a centennial coming around the corner. And they said, well, I'll take that. So away I went, you know. Now, we're out a little early with this, but my thinking is that there's a 30-team NHL today. You can bet your bottom dollar that Gary Bettman is going to defend that 30-team league to his last breath. And he will turn 65 in June 2017, because I know his birthday's 3 days ahead of mine. So he's 65. You can bet that barring something cataclysmic, he's going to be the man to lead the league into its second century, right? And they may celebrate their centennial in 2017-18, which is when the numbers line up, or in 2016-17, which would be the 100th season. Or they may do like the Canadians, you know, have the longest birthday celebration. Just because they have. Some people are tired of celebrating.
Get ready.
I think they'll probably do 2 years, I suspect. So, you know, obviously lots is going to happen between now and then, but I would suspect that Gary Bettman's going to keep 30 teams. He's going to keep 6 or 7 in that deep south, and he's going to protect his legacy. He's going to lead the league, you know, into the next century. So that was kind of my thinking, that we could do this now and come out a bit early, and, you know, we'll miss a few things, but essentially, you know, you've got the history of the league and a different take on it. And then I got some of these guys like Ziegler, who, you know, he's 78, 79, and so he's not going to be around to talk about it forever. And so fortunately, you know, we got him, you know, got to him, and we established a good relationship.
I have that. Did you ask him where he was the weekend of the donut thing? That's always been the big mystery. He's never.
I did, and I didn't get a direct answer. You know what I think happened? I think that he was off on something that had to do with a personal matter, because he talked to me enough. We had, like that weekend I went down there, we got talking about his family. He has 4 kids, he has 3 girls and a son. And I think he was dealing with one of his children, and I think his wife and Wirtz knew where he was, and I think he just went AWOL to ensure that somebody who didn't, you know, wind up with unwanted and unnecessary media attention on somebody else. I think he took the hit so that the media spotlight wasn't on somebody who really didn't belong in the media spotlight, but only would be in it because John Ziegler had to go and deal with some person.
That was a big hit.
Sure, it was a big hit, but it tells you something about the guy, that he took a hit in order to probably shield somebody else from unwarranted and unnecessary media attention. I believe that's what happened. And he told me enough about his family that I could pretty well surmise which one of his children might have been the person who suddenly he needed to get out there and deal with something. That's my guess. That was my guess. And, yes, sir. Last question. Yeah, we would agree.
Amongst the owners and the administrators, who would you say would have demonstrated at least some modicum of creativity and initiative in regard to the operation of the sports league? Very much as you had last interview.
Well, I mean, obviously Bettman. I mean, this guy is, he's a crackerjack guy. He's smart. He's, you know, and this John Collins that they hired, the marketing guy, chief marketing officer, but this guy, he's savvy. I mean, they really like, I mean, under Bettman, they brought consistency to the league. Like Bob Daney was telling me that, he says, you know, the NHL used to be like a glorified senior, you know, in terms of the rinks, dressing room, presentation, and he says, you know, Punch Imlach used to have a 45-minute practice as his warm-ups. Well, now, it's, boom, you have X number of minutes for the warm-up, you get off, you have X number of minutes for the flood, you have 3 minutes for a skate, you have maximum 15 minutes for these pregame presentations and ceremonies, and if you go over, you're fine. It's very professionalized, very standardized, and Bettman's really brought them into life. Like Bob used to say at the events, like your delegation from, like he would do the Stars then, because he was going to these events, and he said, you know, the PR guys for the league would be, you know, grabbing your shirt sleeves to get a picture, and then you just ask for off, you know, they go off to the event. You know, you can tell the league guys to go jump in the lake, and it felt like, well, now, boom, when you show up at those events, they need you for this, you're there to do that, you know. And so it's become a very, you know, the game presentation today is like boom, 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 drill. There's a very set agenda, and commercial, 2-minute breaks, they're all scheduled, and it's all watched, you know, like the video replay center, like when there's a contested goal or something and they go to video replay, you know, that the situation room they have in Toronto, which is up on about the 11th and 12th floor, it's right above the ACC. If you look out the window, you see the great big Air Canada logo on top of the building. And in fact, when the horn goes off in the ACC, you can hear it up in their situation room. This is where they review, they watch these games. But those guys are watching for a lot more. I mean, they're watching for everything. They're watching the referees. They're watching for the game presentations. They're making sure that the commercials are done right. You know, they're watching everything. So it's like they're making sure the product is consistent. So, you know, Bettman's brought that sort of approach. This is a real slick, professional production. You know, there's no local variation. We're going punching inside, doing 45-minute practices, or somebody doing a 37-minute presentation before the game. You know, you run it the way those games with lead decisions. And anyways, I'm not going to take